Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest speaker today is our good friend, Brian McLaren. Brian's an author, speaker, activist, and public theologian, a former college English teacher and pastor. He's a passionate advocate for a new kind of Christianity, just, generous, and working with people of all faiths for common good. He's an Auburn Senior Fellow and leader in the Convergence Network. Brian's been active in networking and mentoring church planters and pastors for many years, but he's probably best known as a thinker and writer. His many books include The Great Spiritual Migration, We Make the Road by Walking, The Galapagos Island, A Spiritual Journey, and A New Kind of Christianity. And they've all won way too many awards for me to list. Brian served as a keynote speaker at Writing for Your Life and has supported our work and the work of many, many others in so many ways. So I always have appreciated him very much, and thank him very much for being here.
Well, I'm so happy to be here, Brian, and I'm so happy for the work that you are doing with Writing for Your Life and how many writers are being encouraged and how much we need their message and their stories. So great to be with you.
Well, thank you so much. Maybe we can start by just, if you would like to share some thoughts on this current crisis and what we can do to make our way through it.
Yeah, it's interesting. It feels a little bit like everyone has been invited into a contemplative or monastic life for a short period of time, at least, in the sense that to stay home and to stop our travel and our running around and all the rest. In a sense, it's an invitation to retreat. Now, I know that's not true for everybody. I know our medical workers, and I was just in a grocery store and I thought of the courage of every person standing at the checkout line to check out groceries, how they have to be aware that they never know which person could infect them. And so not everyone is in this situation, but many of us are. And that creates an opportunity for us to go deep. It creates an opportunity for us to savor the people we're close to maybe slow down to actually enjoy the view out our bedroom window, and so much that is part of the contemplative life. But one of the things that I feel most strongly at this moment is that we have suddenly succeeded in doing what a whole lot of people said could not be done. A lot of us are saying, our current way of life is unsustainable. What we're doing to the planet, what we're doing to the climate is going to require deep changes. And everyone said, oh, those could never happen. They're unrealistic. Well, they just happened. We've just, in a sense, pressed pause on our existing way of life out of necessity. And my hope in this time is that more and more of us will allow ourselves to not be satisfied with just getting back to the old normal, but that instead we could say, no, this is our opportunity. Reality is inviting us to envision a new and better normal that's going to be lived in greater harmony with ourselves, greater harmony with our neighbors, greater harmony with the whole world, because we see how connected we are as never before. And greater harmony with God and greater harmony with this earth. And that is a new reality we're going to have to imagine. And if we don't learn that during this crisis, I think I can say with a high level of confidence that more and worse crises down the road will keep coming back to challenge us to learn this lesson. So I'm all for learning it sooner rather than later.
Well, there's no question that this is going to accelerate some change, right? I mean, just using Zoom alone, right?
Yeah.
Their business has to have gone through the roof
Yeah.
because of the need for communication tools such as this. And I think it's demonstrating to so many folks that you can get a lot accomplished this way without having to travel, as an example.
Exactly right. I couldn't agree with you more. And not only that, but I think when people have an experience of going to the grocery store, as I did this morning, and looking down aisle after aisle and seeing empty shelves, they start to realize, we we better learn how to maybe start a garden, and we better other things that you can't do out of panic because they require long-term planning. But we start to realize, oh, I take an awful lot for granted. And hopefully it's going to make people vote differently, vote with more wisdom, when they start realizing that things that they took for granted or things that they thought were the problem are actually pretty important for our health and survival. So yeah, an enormous opportunity for rethinking, another word for repentance.
So as I mentioned at the beginning, you've written a ton of incredibly useful books, but you've also gone through many challenging times. So right now, I mean, I think a lot of folks are looking to God, looking for ways to deal with some things, right? So maybe you could just talk a little bit about how God's helped you through some of the challenges you've experienced in your life.
Well, I'd love to do that. I want to start by just trying to imagine the real life situations people are in at this moment as we're speaking, Brian. I'm thinking about a mom or a mom and dad who are cooped up in a little one-bedroom apartment with one or two or three kids, and these days are long, and the kids are antsy, and they're fighting, and they're, I mean, I remember what it was like. My wife and I had four small children. We had four children in 6 years, so I know what it's like. But you think, boy, there are people that's their reality right at this moment. Meanwhile, there are people who've lost, on top of that, there are people who have lost their jobs, and the unemployment rates are going to surge. I've heard numbers 25%, 30%, and even higher. And of course, there are places where we think of 30% unemployment as an absolute catastrophe, but there are neighborhoods in many of our cities where there already is a 30% unemployment. And so people are living with that. So you just start multiplying the struggles that we're facing. Not only that, you think about the people who are physically sick, and the tens and hundreds of thousands who will be sick with this virus. And then you think of the caretakers who are up from morning to night. I've just heard stories in the last couple of hours, talking to a few friends on Zoom, of people who I never thought of, whose lives I never, thought about jobs like theirs before, and they're working 16-hour days. One of my neighbors works for the government, and he has to keep track of certain economic indicators. And in this economic chaos, his work becomes more important than ever. It's harder than ever to get that data. So he's working up before dawn, working till late at night. And I think about another friend of mine who's a nurse. So people are under incredible stress right now. Probably one of the toughest challenges in my life was when our third child was 6.5 years old. He was diagnosed with leukemia. So we had four small children, and number three had an intermediate risk leukemia, which when he began treatment, 5-year survival was in the 60 to 70% range. And, suddenly 60 to 70% can sound better than average, but it sure sounds scary when you're a young parent. And so he had 3.5 years of chemotherapy. Every single day he had chemotherapy of some sort. And, we lived with that. And I remember a handful of things that just helped us through. One was that, the fact that we were part of a faith community meant that we were surrounded by people who cared. And I often tell people, you can't wait until the crisis hits to build community and find community. Although if you can, thank God. But all the time and effort we spend in building community when things are going well, we have that wonderful advantage when things aren't going well. I was just talking to a group of pastors yesterday and suggesting that they ought to put up a big sign in front of their church that says, "We're your church, and here's how to contact us if you need help." for all those people who haven't built community up until this point, but really need it. Another thing that really helped us was that we had also already built some depth in prayer and in faith. And those 3.5 years, obviously there were dark moments and there were stressful moments, but in general, we felt that our faith carried us, and we felt God had our back, so to speak. And it was really interesting. I didn't feel any special pressure like, wow, my son is really sick, I've got to pray extra hard. I felt like, no, I've been praying, for years. And in a sense, I didn't have an extra pressure to pray more. I felt that all the life of prayer that I built to that point just kind of carried us. And I felt no pressure at all. I felt the care and presence and love of God with us through that whole time. But then I think one other thing that I'll mention that was super helpful to us through that time was a word that a dear friend brought to me the day after my son was diagnosed. And he said, my advice to you is hope for the best and prepare for the worst. And what that did is it gave me permission to have to imagine every possible eventuality, and in some sense to mentally prepare for the worst. And there's a way you can do that terrifies you, but there's a way that you can do that, I think, in the right spirit, where you say, God will be with me whatever happens. And I think in these times, I think if we're too frantic to get everything fixed, that's going to increase our anxiety level. If we can take a couple of minutes to say, you know what, things are bad, things could get a lot worse, and I'm going to trust God to give me strength when harder moments come. I'll just share one quick anecdote in that regard. So my son was going through chemotherapy, and if one child has childhood cancer, his or her siblings are, I think it's 40 times more likely to have cancer than the general population. Now, thank God that's still not super likely, but 40 times more likely. And I remember, I don't know, halfway into treatment, my son's younger sister, she showed all of the same symptoms that my son had shown. Bruises on her body, lethargy, low-grade fever, pale. And one night I just looked at her and I said, I think she's got it. And so I packed her up. Grace stayed home with the other kids. I packed her up, took her into the hospital on a Saturday night, late Saturday night. And we lived in an urban area, so there were gunshot victims coming in and drunks, and it was a chaotic scene in the emergency room. But I had to get her a blood test to see if her white blood cell counts were normal. And we were there for a couple hours. It was one of the lowest times I've ever felt in my life. But the fact that we weren't afraid to say the worst could happen, something worse could happen, and we're going to trust God to get us through it. That gave me strength. That gave me strength. And so I hope those thoughts could be helpful to other folks in the whole wide range of challenges that we're facing right now.
I think that's extremely powerful, Brian, and I think that universally applicable.
Yeah, thank God around 1:00 in the morning, the doctor came back and said her blood counts are normal. She just has a virus. So, we went home and we were relieved, but that doesn't make it easier in those moments when you're having to bear the possibility of what could be. And I think in ways that any one of us can imagine, other people who are listening to this right now are facing challenges and difficulties that are really, really tough. I just got an email this morning from somebody telling me, talk about a horrible time to have additional crises totally unrelated to this pandemic come crashing in on you, Yeah. So life is so hard, and all we can do is say, I don't feel the strength in myself, but I'm going to keep my heart open for strength beyond my own to flood into me to help me make it through the next moment and the next moment and the next moment. And we make it through.
Well, your comments about support from a church community and support from your faith in God, I mean, that's about as fundamental as it gets, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. And the good news is, it's never too late to start. So we can start right where we are. And if for some people that means I don't even know if I believe in God, but if somebody's out there, I'm open, that's a good start. And wherever we are, we can start.
So one of the objectives of this video series that I'm doing is to offer examples to people if they have some reading time, if they're among the folks that are spending more time at home and want to do some reading. So can we talk a little bit about some of your books?
Yeah, so I thought about that, and probably the book that could be the most relevant to folks is a book I wrote called Naked Spirituality. And this is the British cover. I realize that I've given away all my US covers, but Naked Spirituality, the subtitle is A Life with God in 12 Simple Words. And what I basically structured this book around 12 one-word prayers. And sometimes when life is tough, I find it hard to just construct a complete sentence, And so to have one word that is the word that I can hold up to God, that's sometimes all I can handle, and it's all I need. And so that's what this book is built around. I could share a couple of the words if that would be useful.
Yes, you could. If you could, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Sure. Well, the first three words are I think kind of the primer words for the spiritual life. The first one is here, H-E-R-E, and this a kind of meditative, contemplative prayer that's been important for me is to just be able to sit down, take a few deep breaths, and just say, I'm here. A little bit like you remember in elementary school when the teacher called the roll and you'd raise your hand and say, here. It's a way of, in a sense, showing up to God. I don't think, we pray for God to make God self-present to us. I think God is always present. The question is whether we're showing up to God's presence. And so for me, the word here I am. And my little prayer for this goes like this. I am here. You are here. We are here together. And that simple little prayer of rooting myself in the present moment, letting the past fall behind, letting the future take care of itself, but in this moment to say, I'm here now, and to open myself in the present moment to the presence of God. The second word is thanks, and pretty important in these times to count our blessings, to appreciate. What was Joni Mitchell's that great pop philosopher, Joni Mitchell, her great line, don't it always seem to go, you don't know what you got till it's gone. And probably there are people waking up for the first time missing traffic. But, just the normal experiences of life that seemed even like a bother to some degree, we start to realize, the fact that I could go to that coffee shop and get a great cup of coffee. Oh, the fact that I could go to that restaurant and enjoy a good meal. Oh, yeah, where I live, they just shut down the beaches, that I could go walk on the beach. Suddenly we have an opportunity for gratitude. So the first word is here. Second word is thanks. And the third word is just the letter O, the expression of wonder, to keep our hearts open for wonder. The breathtaking moment, the moment that brings a sigh or even a tear because of its beauty. I've felt this several times just in recent days when I find out that musicians all around the country are putting on free live concerts, online, or that people are having mass dance parties, socially distanced dance party, where some music plays and people in living rooms all around the world are, dancing together at a distance. It's just, to me, I just feel the joy and the connection and the goodness and generosity of people. And it fills my heart with that sense of, oh, wonder and a moment of worship to God and the beauty that God has put into the world. So those are the first three words. I'll just mention the other ones quickly. The second three are prayers that really make sense in times of trouble. Sorry, help, and please. Sorry, where I acknowledge where I've fallen short. I acknowledge where I've chosen wrongly, where I see I've been false or unhelpful or untrue in some way. Help, where I ask for help for myself. I acknowledge my limitations and I open myself to strength and wisdom and resources beyond the limits of what I currently can do. And then please, where that same desire for help that I have for myself, I now ask for this for other people. And I, in a sense, I enter into solidarity with others in need. So sorry, help, and please. The next three are when, no, and why. These are the prayers of struggle and refusal and impatience that we have to have permission to name. And then the last three words are behold, yes, and then silence. The experience of wordless prayer, to just be at rest in God's presence. So that could be a way to help people in this forced monastery time to develop some spiritual practices using simple words.
Well, what a powerful set of words and what a powerful set of prayers. And yes, talk about helpful through these trying times. No question about that.
It's, whether it's anxiety or panic or claustrophobia or hypochondria, we could all be struggling inside of our brains with all kinds of things at this tough time. And to be able to invite our own inner being out of its hamster wheel of anxiety and to just rest and center down and focus, that's pretty important thing. And if we, none of us know how to do this well when we start. And again, it's never too late to start. So these challenges give us opportunities now to deepen that inner life.
So Brian, you also wrote a book about your time on the Galapagos Island, which was a pretty unique experience from what I have gathered. So maybe that would be helpful for people too.
Well, while people are cooped up, sometimes one of the best things to do is to take an imaginative journey. And I had this wonderful experience. I had a once-in-a-lifetime experience that I've now had 3 times. The first time, when that same son I mentioned earlier who had leukemia, when he graduated from high school, I'd kind of made a deal with each of my kids, and that was before they finished high school, we would get them a passport, and the 2 of us would take a trip somewhere in the world together. And so my third child, my son, who'd been so sick, he loved science, he loved biology. He said, what about the Galapagos Islands? So he and I spent 8 days on the Galapagos Islands on a boat. One of the best ways to visit the islands is to stay on a boat. And while you sleep, the boat goes from island to island. And then each day you snorkel and you hike and you enjoy the beautiful place. So that had been many, many years ago. And then a few years ago, an editor friend called me and said, hey, we have been thinking about asking some people who write about theology to do theology in a place. And the idea is we would send you to a place and invite you to theologize and write about that place. He said sort of 1 part travel book, 1 part memoir, 1 part theological reflection. And so he said, we were thinking about sending you to the Galapagos Islands if you'd be willing to go. And I said, could I think about it for 7 seconds? And so he said, we can't pay you, but we'll pay your way. So I got to go back and write about it in this book. And it was a wonderful experience for me, Brian, because you're so familiar with the writing process, you'll appreciate this. So many of my books, I have a message. I'm trying to address this problem, or I'm trying to solve this issue, or I'm trying to explain this set of ideas. But in this book, they basically just said, we want you to go and write about whatever comes to you. And so it gave me the chance to just be a writer and enter into the moment. So the first 8 chapters, each chapter is devoted to one of the days of the trip, what I saw, what I experienced, kind of with the idea that most people are never going to be able to go there. So here would be a kind of way to have an imaginative experience there. And then the next several chapters were after I got home, it gave me a chance to reflect on some elements of my experience. So one of the chapters is called Ichthyology instead of Ichthyology with a T-H-E instead of a Y. So theology of fish, because a lot of our time was spent snorkeling and seeing the beautiful underwater life. Another is herpetotheology, a theology of reptiles. Another is ecotheology. Another is evotheology, a theology of evolution, since Charles Darwin, was in the islands and they played a role in his development of the theory of evolution. So just one of the funnest writing experiences I've ever had. Just joy to write the book, and folks have told me that's come through in their reading. That might be a nice imaginative escape for people who are trapped in sheltering in place.
That's just what I was thinking about. It sounds like a great escape.
I think it could be a good escape, and maybe a way of letting your imagination go where your body can't go right now.
So Brian, you wrote another short ebook that I'm a big fan of. Why don't they get it? Which
Yes.
talks about all kinds of different forms of biases.
Yes.
And so maybe you've got some examples of how that's playing out right now.
Well, first, yeah, and that's actually a good one to suggest, because anybody could download it. It's easy to download at my website, brianmclaren.net, and it's super cheap, less than a cup of coffee. Or less than a cup of good coffee, let's say it that way. Yeah, it's called Why Don't They Get It? Understanding Bias in Others and Yourself. And really, this is a result of something that happened to me during the last election in 2016. I just felt like different political parties and different voters are living on different planets. It's not just that we have different ideas, it's that we have different whole thought patterns. And it disturbed me, because I felt it just seemed like we're not working off the same facts, and we're not working off the same logic. So I consulted some friends of mine who are psychologists and communication experts and some philosophers, and really tried to do a deep dive into the literature on bias, the things that keep us from thinking clearly. And my gosh, what an exciting research project that was for me. So I turned that into a short ebook, and I talk about different kinds of bias, and then I talk about how to address or overcome that bias in yourself, and then maybe even to help others as well. The words of Jesus come to mind when he said, "Don't try to take the splinter out of your brother's eye when you have a plank in your own." And all of us can see the biases of other people, but until we start to pay attention to our own biases, I don't think we'll be very effective. We'll just do more harm than good in trying to convince anybody else of anything. People believe what they believe for reasons that make sense to them. And if we don't learn how to understand the logic and the bias patterns that are going on in ourselves, we won't be able to understand them in others. And we will very often, in trying to challenge them to change their thinking, we will actually make them dig their heels in more deeply and become even more resistant to better ideas and more defensive of bad ideas that they're holding for reasons that we don't understand. So that's the big idea behind that book.
So Brian, one of the really, I think, important and compelling aspects of that endeavor, that book that you just described, was also looking at how Jesus would overcome many of those biases in his words.
Yes.
It was just fascinating.
Well, I got to tell you, it was so fascinating for me. So I was doing this research, and I came up with, I tried to be as exhaustive as I could possibly be, but I came up with a list of 13 discrete kinds of bias. And that might sound like a lot, but actually once you start working with them, it's a workable number. But every time I would seize on a kind of bias and begin to understand it, I would come across something in the Gospels, and suddenly you see, oh, Jesus is trying to help people overcome that kind of bias. I'll give you an example. There's something called confirmation bias. It's one of the most powerful biases. And the basic idea is that all of us get mental maps or mental models or paradigms or systems of thinking or worldviews set up in our brain. And when a new idea comes in, before we even consciously analyze it, the deeper unconscious parts of our brain have evaluated that new idea, and they've made a decision. This fits with what we already think, or this goes against what we already think. And if it goes against, before we've had a conscious thought about it, we reject it. In fact, sometimes we don't even see it. We don't even hear it. And if it fits with what we already think, we welcome it because it helps us feel more secure. Well, then with that in mind, you think about all the times where Jesus says things like this: whoever has ears to hear, let him hear. Or you think about all of the statements he makes about people being blind. He says to the Pharisees at one point, you claim that we see. That's why, your blindness is all the more culpable. Or you think even when Jesus would say, you've got to become like a little child. You've got to deconstruct all of those confirmation bias grids to be able to see some things that you haven't seen. You've got to go back and start all over again. I think that's a big part of what's behind that phrase, born again. You've got to start afresh. Even the word repent is to rethink your assumptions, to challenge your confirmation bias. And then you look at Jesus telling parables. What's a parable? A parable is a story that draws your imagination into somebody else's world. And another great way to try to loosen the bolts of confirmation bias. Another really powerful bias that I had to deal with in the writing of this little ebook is what I call complexity bias. It turns out this has been proven by all kinds of psychological experiments. The human brain prefers a simple lie to a complex truth. So before an idea even goes through our rational filters, if it feels complex, our brains have a negative reaction to it on a subconscious level that makes us not even consciously consider it. But simplicity, we really welcome. And so you look at Jesus' teaching again. He uses many simple, repeated phrases like the kingdom of God. So a very simple phrase. But once you are interested in that phrase, then he says, well, the kingdom of God is like, and he tells a story, the kingdom of God is like. And so what he has to do is he has to trick us into deeper thinking through a familiar phrase and then the use of parables. I'll just tell you, for every single one of the 13 biases, it just became obvious that Jesus, I know this isn't in any of the creeds, but Jesus was just smart. and what a master communicator. And even then, let's be honest though, as great a communicator as Jesus was, a whole lot of people stayed stuck in their bias, and they wouldn't even they wouldn't listen. And that's a reminder to us of how powerful bias is and how our approach to communicating with others has to have grace and humility and a whole lot of patience baked into it.
Well, there's a couple of reasons why I was so impressed with that book. And one of them was your analysis, to be able to break down the problem into all these different segments that, once you understand that area of bias, you could just see it like crazy.
Yeah.
right? You see examples of it in so many different ways. And then to be able to take all these things that Jesus said and show, demonstrate very clearly how he was dealing with those specific, types of biases and overcoming them in his statements. It's just, kind of mind blowing.
I mean, I love Jesus, but my respect and admiration for his life and teaching just keeps growing. The older I get, it's like, wow, he was even better than I ever thought. So
Brian, I know you keep an incredibly busy schedule, and even during this time of change, I'm sure you're involved in many different interesting things. So any of those you'd like to tell us about?
Sure. Well, let me just mention two things, especially. I'm involved with something called Vote Common Good. If people are interested in that, our hope is that we can help people when they go into the election booth in November to go in not just with self-interest, but go in having opened their hearts to the common good and open their minds to the common good. I'm very excited about what's going on with Vote Common Good at votecommongood.com. And then I'm involved with the Center for Action and Contemplation. Folks, probably many are familiar with Richard Rohr and the good work of the center, and I'm doing some teaching with them. And so that's another wonderful group and great resources for folks at this time to use this time and where everyone's apartment or home becomes a hermitage to develop our contemplative practices. So those are two organizations I'm involved with that folks might want to look into.
Well, Brian, it's always such an incredible pleasure to spend time with you and hear your thoughts on any different subject that I think that I could possibly throw at you. So thank you very much for spending this time with us and sharing all those thoughts.
Well, thanks to you for pulling this together. Thanks to everybody who's trusted us with their time to tune in. God bless you all. Keep up the good work.